Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to our panel in this early morning and for uh, listening to my talk. I hope you enjoy it. So my talk is entitled The Clash of Scientific Assessors. And the more important thing is the subtitle, which I didn't have the space to place here. So it goes on the next slide. So is glyphosate carcinogenic? And if so, does it really matter? And on this picture, you cannot see glyphosate apparently, but you can see the results of its use. This is a huge soybean field somewhere in Argentina, and it goes for miles and miles and miles like this. And the people who don't like glyphosate call these fields green deserts. And this is just a taster of what's coming later in this talk, but this might be the thing that matters more when it comes to regulation of this pesticide. But I will bear with me and I will return to this later. So I'm sure that everybody in the audience has heard at least a little bit about the glyphosate and associated controversies, but very briefly, glyphosate is the most widespread pesticide in the world. It is used for already 30 years, and it became immensely popular since Monsanto, its main producer, although it is generic now and it's produced by many others, but Monsanto introduced it and made it popular with their under the commercial name Roundup. So it became really popular since Monsanto also managed to produce genetically modified crops which are tolerant of glyphosate. They are Roundup Ready, they're called Roundup Ready, and they are tolerant they are genetically modified to survive glyphosate, while all weeds can perish. So it sounds wonderful. The controversy, very briefly, the history, there was a risk assessment going on by the European Food Safety Authority, which is competent for such decisions in the European Union. The assessment itself took some 4 years. And in the same time, there was a risk assessment for renewal of glyphosate by the American Environmental Protection Agency, which is the competent authority there. In both cases, it was they were decisions for reauthorization of something which was already widely used. And perhaps it wouldn't raise any controversies, and I wouldn't be talking to you about it if there wasn't accidentally one unexpected player that interfered, which is the International Agency for Research on Cancer, which at some point completely independently of the assessment process, of the official reauthorization processes, decided that glyphosate is probably carcinogenic. And then it made huge headlines outside of the specialized circles and outside of the protest of some environmental organizations. Notwithstanding this, IARC's decision doesn't matter too much for regulatory purposes, as we will see. In 2017, the European Union reauthorized glyphosate for the next 5 years. It was a difficult decision, and it was reauthorized for 5 years as opposed to 15 to 20 as it was initially expected. So the new reauthorization is just around the corner. Now, how are such decisions taken, and why all this matter, and why I discussed them in the first place? I discussed them. I look into this because they are very interesting test case that shows the problems with the established paradigm of risk regulation, which relies on division of risk assessment, which is allegedly scientific, and risk management, which is admittedly political. And they are very rigidly separated, or at least they're trying to separate. The regulators around the world are trying to separate them. That's why I call this the separation paradigm. And it is believed that by this separation of the scientific and political, we have what we call now science-based regulation. And every time when there are some problems with it and it is questioned, the integrity of the system is questioned, the response is by strengthening science, meaning drawing even deeper borders, even reinforcing the border between risk assessment and risk management. And my view is that this is flawed, and I will show now that glyphosate shows why this is flawed. One problem is, or unintended, or maybe even unintended, or maybe even intended side effect is that with this system, the separation, the issue is framed very narrowly. In the case of glyphosate, the risk assessment was about its safety. And as a nice, probably nice, not so nice, side effect, this system relies on what it on the assumption that the science can give one right answer. So risk assessment, if it is really strong science, and science is good, and the science is unbiased and free from political interference, scientists all around the world will reach the same conclusions, right? Well, not so with glyphosate, because it was authorized in the US, and it wasn't, it was almost failed to get authorized in the EU. And similarly, not so with another pesticide, a group of pesticides called neonics, neonicotinoids, which are allegedly harmful for bees, and they were authorized in the US but banned effectively in the EU. So we cannot get always one right answer from this system, but nevertheless it is sustained on this assumption, and when it fails, there is one very easy explanation. Well, there is this dichotomy between science and democracy. People don't get science well, and that's why they disagree with what science has established. And this has always been the response. Now, the glyphosate controversy is interesting because the disagreement was between scientific bodies. IARC, the International Research Agency for Cancer, is expert scientific assessors, and they said that glyphosate is probably carcinogenic. On the other hand, the European Food Safety Authority, they are also expert, they also claim best science, and they completely disagree with this. So why scientists disagree? Is it carcinogenic or not? And now the easy explanation between science, that the conflict is between science and democracy, in this case falls apart. And that's why this is what makes the case interesting. So just a few brief notes how each of the two agencies are making the decisions, and which will immediately make obvious why they disagree. So the features of the IARC assessment is that it identifies only the hazard. It does not make risk assessment, meaning that it decides whether glyphosate can or cannot cause cancer, regardless of the level of exposure. So even if you need very high amounts of glyphosate exposure so that the adverse effect is triggered, which allegedly is the case with glyphosate, then they will say, well, okay, this is really, this can cause cancer, that's why we will put it on our lists. And the other specific feature of IARC assessment is that it considers active substances and compounds. Glyphosate is rarely used by itself. It is usually used in a mixture with other things. And then if there is adverse effect, the question is immediately, is it caused by glyphosate or is it caused by the other things? Another very interesting feature is that IARC is relying only on academic papers published peer-reviewed as academic papers should be. And finally, last but not least, as the saying is, its decisions do not have any direct regulatory implications. So they are in the proverbial ivory tower, and they don't have to care when they decide. Their judgment is not burdened by any possible fears of what such a decision will entail. On the other hand, EFSA its assessments are hugely important. Based on EFSA's assessment as for whether something is safe or not, decision is taken. And it's very difficult for the Commission, the European Commission, which is the political manager, the risk manager, the political authority, it's very difficult to diverge from EFSA's decision. So it decided in this case that glyphosate is unlikely to cause cancer, and it assesses risk and not hazard. So it may very well say, well, glyphosate can cause cancer, but at such high levels of exposure that no one is really exposed to in practice, so it is safe to use. And the other important thing is that it relies on industry data. So the applicants themselves, Monsanto and the like, when they apply, they are required to prepare a dossier with their own studies. So it is very heavily dependent on the industry information, although it can take into account academic studies. And finally, it assesses only the active substance and not any mixtures. The real pesticides that we can buy from the shops, they are not subject to its assessments. They may be subject to national assessments, but glyphosate is to be isolated and assessed. And these differences are by all, in both cases, they are prescribed by law, or in the case of IARC, by their founding documents, which may not be strictly law as an academic would call them, but nevertheless, they are strict regulations which both agencies have to follow. And as we can see, the small differences between, I spent so much time explaining the technical differences, because you can see that these technical differences may be hugely significant. And in the end of the day, they led the two agencies to reach their different conclusions. And so what follows from this? Why is all this interesting? The first thing is that it shows the deep entanglement between the law and the legal, the rules on one hand, and the science on the other. So both our scientific agencies, both excellent scientists are working, but because of their institutional environment and because of the law that regulates their proceedings, like what kind of studies published or industry, or what kind of compounds or mixtures or pure substances are being subject to evaluation, etc. These things determine the ultimate decision, the ultimate assessment about the safety. So it brings home the point that law and science are entangled all the way down. Like in an Escher painting, you cannot remove the birds and see only the fish. The fish will also disappear, or you cannot remove the fish because the birds will disappear. So they're entangled because each defines the other. Law defines what standards the scientists will use, and science determines what is the subject matter of the law in this case, and what without the scientific bit, the law will lose its point, its raison d'etre. So given this controversy and these diverging opinions, then if we have a question is, if we return to the title question, is glyphosate carcinogenic or not? How do you feel? Well, the more interesting question is this scientific question? Is it really that scientists are telling you whether glyphosate is carcinogenic or not? Or perhaps it is the lawyers who drafted the relevant regulations, or the politicians who adopted them, or maybe in the IARC case, the relevant ministers who approved certain conventions which created IARC. It becomes unclear who is answering the question. And then, does it really matter whether glyphosate is carcinogenic or not? If we have not forgotten about this green desert thing, it may give us a pause whether carcinogenicity, of course, immensely more important issue, especially given that glyphosate is currently used throughout the world, and probably if we test our bodies, half of the people who are listening to this will have some glyphosate present in their bodies. So it is a hugely important question. But what is it that we are not talking about when we talk about carcinogenicity? So there are other health effects. Equally important is whether glyphosate disturbs our endocrine system. And some other health effects have also been identified, or at least allegedly identified, but these were left completely out. And then, what about the complementarity with GMOs? Glyphosate became so widespread when these genetically modified crops were introduced, and this complementarity between glyphosate and GMOs enabled the green deserts. These huge amount of fields which are very easy to produce, very easy to cultivate, with requiring little labor, and allowing such large-scale farming that all the natural environment is extinguished, and even whole communities, villages, and towns may be displaced because it's more suitable to turn this into a farmland and raise soybean on industrial scale. And then there is an issue about dependence on Monsanto, now Bayer. So it is at least not American, it is European. But anyway, so several huge companies control the production of certain product that all farmers around the world depend. This may give us legitimate concerns for some. I don't say that any of this is a problem per se. It's that I see any of these as a problem, but notwithstanding this, it is a problem for certain groups of people, and this may be a huge problem for them. And then there is the problem with super weeds. So once you use certain pesticides intensely, the pests start to evolve and they start to develop resistance. And then you need even more pesticide, or you need a brand new pesticide to be invented. And then for this brand new, there is new round of resistance, and this treadmill goes on forever. It might be excellent for the producer of pesticides, of course, and they will build this as innovation and great thing, but farmers may not be necessarily happy with this. And I do not have the time to go through all such problems which one could imagine would be taken into consideration when glyphosate had to be reauthorized. And especially given that the discussion was held at a very high level, involving even heads of states, like the French president, who got involved at some point and weighed in against glyphosate. So the discussion was very intense at very high level, but none of these things are listed on this slide was ever mentioned. All that was discussed was carcinogenic. And then the problem is what I call leverage and proxy wars. Glyphosate and carcinogenicity of glyphosate became proxy for all these things. And perhaps I can skip this, why everybody focused on carcinogenicity, and come to the leverage and proxy wars, which are the more important thing. So one thing that becomes clear is that technical details have political significance. But at least for the PNS community, this is hardly new, so I will not discuss this at a great detail. I will, at any detail, actually, I'll skip this. The other thing is that technical rules give unaccounted advantages. So one tiny rule in a particular regulation, which says that if something is carcinogenic, if a pesticide is carcinogenic, then it cannot be authorized. Very tiny, obscure rule somewhere in the appendixes of unknown regulation, unknown to the general public. This makes a huge difference. This is what made glyphosate pivotal, a carcinogenicity pivotal for the authorization of glyphosate, and a tiny change, say, if it is carcinogenic, you may consider phasing out, but you do not have to necessarily to ban automatically. Then a tiny change in the law could result in entirely different discussion. So technical rules give unaccounted advantages to some people in some situations, which unaccounted because they are completely unexpected. So the environmentalists were campaigning against glyphosate for ages and with no success. And now they were very close to being successful and getting glyphosate banned, because of this IARC, this unexpected statement by IARC, which played upon this rule that carcinogenic pesticides cannot be banned. If they are toxic otherwise, they can still be authorized, and their use can be monitored and managed. But if they're carcinogenic, there is this tiny rule that entails ban. And this rule is what gives leverage to the glyphosate protesters. And the other important thing is that this technical rule determines that carcinogenity matters more than any of these things. So these may be important for some people, they may be not important for others, but or from if we can take a bird's eye view, they are not they shouldn't be any less important than carcinogenicity. Yet they were completely off the table, completely obscured because of this tiny little provision, and which gave leverage to one, made one issue pivotal, and thus gave leverage to particular arguments on either side. So what would be the alternative approach then? And I'm drawing to a close, understanding that I have hugely overstepped my time. So what would be the post-normal approach? The first approach, now safety only, made carcinogenic, and the picture is of cancer cells. The picture on the left is on cancer cells, so this had priority under the standard science-based regulation approach. What would be the post-normal approach? Well, the obvious answer that we would give is, well, all these other factors should be taken into account. But then there is the problem. Whenever I make presentations and say about all other factors, people immediately ask me, okay, what are the other factors that should be taken into account, and should we take into account, because we obviously cannot take into account absolutely everything, absolutely every concern that someone can think of. And this is a problem that so far I think has not received any satisfactory answer. And now in the last minute that I have, last minute I don't have perhaps, I'll try to give an answer to this. So there is a nice paper by John Dreizek and Simon Niemeyer from 2008, which is in political philosophy. So the scholars of science you have probably ignored, but I find it very useful, and they argue, because they argue for what they call discursive representation. And they claim that for issues of huge importance for the world, like climate change, or biodiversity loss and such kind of world peace, it makes sense to create what they call a global chamber of discourses, where all kinds of discourses as opposed to states or interests should be presented. So there should be, there is in the world discourse of protecting the environment, so there should be some people speaking for environment. There is discourse about development, so the people who care about development, they should be there and present their arguments. And people should, in this chamber, shall present their arguments as opposed to their interests. And I would suggest that in risk assessments, we can have virtual assessment, such a chamber virtually. Now, today, obviously, we have all sorts of things virtually, but I came up with this idea much before the COVID crisis. So we can have within the risk assessment process, risk assessment, not risk management, we can have consultations with what we normally call stakeholders. Now, stakeholders are usually relegated to the risk management when it may be too late. If the risk assessor says something is safe, then there is very little chance for the risk for the stakeholders to make a difference at risk management level. So there should be consultations where stakeholders will say what are the considerations they care about. And this should happen in risk assessment. And so far, this might not be too original, but then the question is, what are the concerns? Who are the stakeholders that will allow, and how shall we accommodate everyone's claims, as divergent as they are? And my answer is that because we will try to reconstruct discourses as opposed to interests, so everybody who has something different to say will be allowed to speak. We will seek to reconstruct arguments and discourses rather than individual opinions. Rather than in the interests of different groups of people. So, for example, if several religious groups with contrasting views have the same narrative that, say, genetic modification is against the will of God, and we should not be playing God, then we can lump together, say, Muslims and Christians or other faith with completely at odds with each other, but they have the same argument. And I don't say that we have to agree, the decision maker has to agree with this argument, but they have to listen to it on its own terms, and they have to accommodate this argument. So all this, in this way, all these concerns, which so far are firmly excluded, they will find their representation in this virtual chamber of discourses constructed within the risk assessment process. And I don't say that everybody should be accommodated and everybody shall have its way. It is not possible, of course. No decision will ever be taken, but it at least gives them a chance to have their voice heard and to have somebody changing their opinion because they were heard. For the time, it may sound like trivial, but for the time being, this is not done anywhere in the world. And when these concerns that you see listed here, when they are not even heard because they do not relate directly to safety, we cannot even begin to understand the concerns of the legitimate concerns that various people, various groups of stakeholders legitimately have. And while we are doing so, we cannot help but force them into proxy wars and try to use evidence for what they can, for the things that count, as opposed to the things that they want to make a point with. All right, thank you very much. That was all. I'm sorry that it took me so long. I hope you are still with me and haven't switched to another channel. Thank you very much indeed.